I spent a lot of my career in the litigation arena, and so I approach this in terms of evidence. And I know that my viewers and listeners know that I'm very much a scientist and empiricist. I want to give them the most non-circumstantial, non-inferential evidence that we can. And Louis, I certainly don't want to ask you to tread on any NDAs or boundaries that you have with your security clearance at all. But in terms of what we can talk about, what is the best evidence we have, the absolute best hard evidence we have that something not of this world, not of planet Earth, exists, that tells us that some intelligent life form not of planet Earth exists and has visited this planet?
Wow. So a lot to unpack there. Let me see if I can start from the beginning. First and foremost, I agree with your perspective on evidence driving the conversation. My background, I went to school, University of Miami, and I was in the medical program. I graduated as a microbiologist, immunologist, and I studied parasites. So I've always considered myself a disciple of the scientific methods and principles. And then later I became a special agent and ultimately a special agent in charge, working national security crimes, so espionage, terrorism, and things like that, where my job was to present information in essence to a jury and present that information in a way that allowed the jury to come up with a result. And in this case, if you were to ask me, based upon the empirical evidence that I have been and my colleagues have been privy to, we are well beyond reasonable doubt. Any rational-minded jury would have no choice but to convict and say, yes, this is real. Let's not forget, as Bryce had just indicated, we had multiple senior officials in the government already come out and have this conversation. We had a former director of the CIA. We had a former director of the National Intelligence, DNI, Radcliffe. We had a former president of the United States all come out and say, yeah, there's something to this, and this is a national security issue. So what is the best evidence? Well, it's kind of like choosing my favorite child. Each case is different. Each of them can be extremely compelling. In some cases, we have ultra high definition video of these things 15 feet away from a cockpit of an aircraft. Which is, it's not a blurry object you see from far away. It's crystal clear. It's very, very clearly something that is not our technology. And then when you look at this and you look at the temporal aspect, which I think is very important here, let's go back 70 years where we have actually radar tracks of these things doing 10,000, 13,000 miles an hour in low Earth atmosphere, where the air friction is really almost impossible to deal with at those speeds. Where were we as a nation? Well, we had just barely broken the sound barrier, and we hadn't even been into space yet. So when you look at these things performing in ways where they're put this in compare and contrast it, the average human being can withstand about 9 G forces for a short period of time before their medical consequences, things such as blackouts, redouts, and ultimately death. If you compare that to one of the most highly maneuverable manned aircraft we have today, it's the General Dynamics F-16 Fighting Falcon. It's an older air platform, but still considered one of the most highly maneuverable. And that can perform at the unclassified level about 17, 18 Gs before you start having structural failure, meaning wings begin to snap off and the airframe will begin to disintegrate around you as you're flying it. These are objects that we are recording that are doing not 18, 19, 20 Gs. They're doing 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 Gs. They're performing these maneuvers while traveling at hypersonic velocity, 5 times the speed of sound. So think about that. And by the way, we do have some aircraft that can fly at those speeds. For example, the Lockheed YF-12A SR-71, aka the Blackbird. But when that is flying at, let's say Mach 5, when it wants to take a right-hand turn, it takes roughly half the state of Ohio to execute that maneuver. And what we are seeing are objects going several times faster than that and able to perform immediate right-angle turns, 180-degree turns. And so if any country back in the 1950s or 60s had this technology, Meanwhile, the very best of our intelligence community had absolutely no clue. This would be considered probably the greatest intelligence failure our country has ever faced, eclipsing that of even 9/11, because that means someone has been able to develop this technology in secret and deploy it back at a time where we had barely broken the sound barrier, right? And if you look at our adversaries, where was Russia? Well, they had not yet, or were just on the cusp of deploying the atomic bomb, demonstrating they had the atomic weapon, and China was in a famine. So, what country on earth had that ability? Back then, I think it'd be kind of like trying to, if you would, compare walking into King Tut's tomb for the very first time back in the 1920s, and all of a sudden discovering a fully assembled 747 jet plane in there, commercial aircraft. It doesn't make sense temporally.
Hey, Dr. Phil here. Your savings are at risk. With the economy on shaky ground, the dollar losing value, and a $2 trillion deficit, things could spiral. Don't wait for the worst. Take control of your financial future now. I trust Preserve Gold to safeguard my accounts, and I urge you to do the same. They're the only precious metals company I recommend. What are you going to do to protect what's yours? Claim your special offer and learn how to reinforce your financial future. Visit drphilgold.com to get your free precious metals guide from Preserve Gold. With gold prices recently breaking records and analysts predicting this trend to continue through 2025, you cannot afford to wait. As a bonus, you can get up to $15,000 with a qualified purchase from Preserve Gold. So don't wait. Visit drphilgold.com today.
I'm the son of a history teacher, so I look at the historical narrative as much as Lewis covered specifically some of the things that they're doing right now. And I would suggest they've been doing these things all through history, particularly since World War II. I'm not going to get into naming, there's hundreds of cases, but like, for example, in 1952, over 2 weekends, clusters of these UFOs flew over the nation's capital and were seen by so many people. And it even knocked the Democratic Convention that summer off the front page in Washington. And these UFOs that were flying over the Capitol took the front page. Imagine if that happened today. I mean, my goodness, we'd be all over it. So I approve of what you're saying. You think that we should try to apply science and reason, and I think that's fantastic. And one of the things that I would just suggest is, if you do that and you're trying to ask yourself, well, what could be the possible explanations for this? I'll give you what I think they could be. Number one would be that people are just getting it wrong. All right. You'd have to believe that the nature of consciousness and perception is such that hundreds of thousands of people over 80 years have gotten it wrong. Or you'd have to believe that people we know are flawed and sometimes do lie. So you'd have to say that could be an explanation. And the third one would be, it's, as Lou implied, it would be the largest hoax of disinformation ever perpetrated in human history. Or the fourth one, which is something anomalous is actually going on and has been going on for a while. So I encourage everybody to start looking into it and taking it seriously, because that's really what's held us back over all these years. The policy that goes back to 1953, when there was a government commission with the CIA in a declassified document where they said, we need to come up with a policy of denial and ridicule. That's how we answer this. And denial and ridicule work so well that stigma has still existed somewhat through today, although those twin pillars are starting to fall even as we speak, your show being an example of that.
But what's the point? I know there's a certain arrogance to, hey, we're the only ones. And that certainly is an arrogant attitude. But what's the upside to the denial across time if these craft we're seeing on radar at such great speeds and maneuverability, credible, reliable witnesses in terms of military pilots that are trained? I've been a pilot since I was a teenager. You're trained to spot traffic and aircraft and that sort of thing. And when you see something that's close enough that you can tell its composition, you've gotten way too close to another airplane. And that is a very unusual occurrence. That doesn't happen every day. You are required to report that as a near miss and et cetera. But when you have people that are credible, that are reporting these things, and you don't see them seeking notoriety, fame, fortune, anything of the sort. They're just reporting it as in the scope of their duties. You have to start saying, okay, we need to take this seriously. What is the motive to hide this, to deny this, to ridicule this? What's the motive?
You'd have to look to history. In 1960, for example, the Rand Corporation did a report on what would happen if we sort of disclosed that we are not, or found out at that time, the way they looked into it, that we are not alone. And they were very, very concerned that people might not handle the truth very well. So that's the number one reason that has potentially explained it over the years. I think there was a concern that saying to people, by the way, there's another intelligence operating on our planet. We don't really know exactly what it is, and we can't do much about it. I think the feeling was that would hit the public with the same magnitude as the JFK assassination or Pearl Harbor or 9/11, and that it would radically change the world we live in the way that COVID or the stock market crash back in 1928 did. And so people have been concerned about that. I don't share that concern now. I think we live in a different time. But let me turn it back to Lou for the national security, because that's clearly what has driven a lot of this over the years.
Yeah, Louis, what do you think about national security on this?
Well, first of all, we have a long history of suppressing information that doesn't comport to at the time, our current understanding of our world and our paradigm that we live in. Case in point, countries like ours, you're supposed to classify information simply to protect sources and methods and keep information out of the hands of the enemy. But the reality is we have a long history of abusing that process for other reasons. One of them is to protect the psyche of the American people. And two, also, is that the U.S. government and other governments don't like to admit a problem for which there is no solution. So case in point, when back in the 50s, when the CIA was working with Lockheed Skunk Works to build the U-2 airplane in contravention of the treaty we had with Russia, when we first started flying the airplane, we wanted to build a plane that could fly faster and higher than any other aircraft so we could actually fly over mainland Russia and take photographs, reconnaissance. And so we did just that. And guess what? The Russians didn't respond. So mission success. It wasn't until the Russians were able to develop the SA-2 surface-to-air missile and successfully shoot down a U-2 and parade the pilots in front of the United Nations and the wreckage, did the Russians even admit to their own people that they were actually tracking every single flight that we had over Russia. But they did not want to make a big deal of it or even announce it to anybody, especially their own people, until they had a solution for it. And let's look at this topic now. Historically, height of the Cold War, you had then Soviet Union against the United States in this kind of winner-takes-all proxy chess game around the world. And despite the words of the Cold War being cold, it actually was pretty hot. There was a lot of activity going on in the world, and it was us versus them. And they, by the way, had their own UFO program too. A lot of people don't know that. But neither country wanted to admit that there was this technology out there for which there was no solution. We did not want to let the American people know that there was any other type of threat that was, frankly, far more sophisticated than the Soviets and even us. And then you, of course, have the other issue about governmental preeminence, the idea that governments work only because the people have faith and confidence in those institutions, and we expect solutions by our government. And so here's another example for you and your audience. Back when the Dead Sea Scrolls were first found in the late 40s, it was many, many years before the scientific community actually released the translation of those Dead Sea Scrolls. And the reason was, one of the primary reasons, that we were afraid it was going to upset the current Judeo-Christian belief system, that it was going to contradict the very moral fiber of our country. For the record, I disagree that these are legitimate reasons to keep information classified and away from the American people, but we have a long history of doing this, and so do other countries. And so when you have a topic like this about UFOs or UAP able to come into our controlled airspace without any type of impunity, they're able to interfere with our nuclear equities. This is a really tough conversation to have with the American people. And oh, by the way, we don't have a solution for it. So it's not in the best interest of governments to admit problems for which they have no solution. And I think this topic is certainly a very clear case of exactly that.